Hey everyone, welcome to the Open Inquiry Podcast. My name is Danylo. So in this episode, I'm speaking with Duncan Sabien about rationality. Duncan has done a lot of work on the subject of rationality, including writing books and essays discussing various elements of human rationality, and he's presented lectures on rationality with organizations like Effective Altruism and the Center for Applied Rationality. Duncan has a fun and unique bio here describing his interests and current work, so I'll quickly read it. Duncan Sabien is a writer, teacher, and maker of things. He loves parkour, Legos, and Magic the Gathering, and is easily manipulated by people quoting Ender's Game. He's currently working with an organization trying to figure out how to create provably safe artificial intelligence and writing a pair of books on the side. So Duncan and I cover a lot of ground in this conversation. We discuss the rationality community, challenges to spreading and popularizing rationality, problems in psychology-related publicity, psychological obstacles to being rational, the value of emotions, the importance of jargon for learning and discourse, learning in progressive stages, creativity in rational discourse, real-world impacts of public discourse, social regulation of reasoning standards, and more. I've been a huge fan of Duncan's work for a long time, and I was actually quite nervous as I approached this interview, so you might notice that I'm speaking rather quickly at times in the interview, and I apologize in advance if I'm tricky to follow at all. But as you'll hear, Duncan is a remarkably clear thinker and speaker on the subject of rationality, and he provides a wide range of deeply fascinating insights here. Rationality as a human capacity turns out to be a lot more complex than it may initially seem. Anyway, it was an honor to have Duncan on the podcast to help navigate this important terrain, and I hope you find the discussion valuable. One final note here is that we originally recorded this interview in July of 2021, and at one point in the conversation, we touch on the COVID-19 pandemic. So any statistics we cite during the conversation are based on that point in time, July 2021. So with all that said, here's our conversation. So today I'm speaking with Duncan Sabien. Thanks so much for joining me, Duncan. It's an honor to have you.
Yeah, great to be here.
So today I want to focus on three general questions. The first being, what is the rationalist community? The second being, why isn't it more popular? And the second being, what should it be or what could it be? And before we jump into these three primary questions, I think it'd be great if you could summarize for the audience just what you do generally, what organizations you work with, what organizations you have worked with before.
Yeah, so currently I work with the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, often initialized as MIRI. That's a group that's working on developing provably safe artificial intelligence, like known to be safe from the ground up, as opposed to made safe after the fact. And before that, I worked at the Center for Applied Rationality, which is sort of MIRI's cousin org, which focuses on human intelligence and human rationality and cognition. I had a friend who went down to work for MIRI. I had another friend who attended one of CFAR's workshops and told me to go to a workshop. And then eventually I sort of joined the community through there.
Okay, wonderful. And when did that happen approximately?
Yeah, so that was back in late 2014 was when I attended a CFAR workshop, and I went to work for CFAR in 2015, and I was there for about 3 years as the curriculum director.
So with that being said, I wonder if you would be comfortable with just characterizing generally what your relationship with the rationalist community is. And we'll get into characterizing exactly what that even means. And it's kind of difficult to characterize sometimes, I know, but how would you characterize your relationship generally with that community?
Yeah, my own personal relationship with the community is one of sort of like exasperated allyship or something. It definitely seems to me that the rationalists are doing approximately the least wrong of all the groups that are out there trying to like solve the important problems, trying to figure out how to figure out everything, that sort of thing. I certainly have lots of frustrations with the community here and there. I'm currently more of like a satellite member rather than a core member. I'm kind of in the rationalist fringe. But there's certainly no groups that I know of whose intentions are in a better place. And I think sometimes my own frustrations with the rationalist community have more to do with them falling short of a very high standard that they're setting for themselves than anything else.
Right. Okay. So we'll definitely try. I think we'll have some time to get into those frustrations in more detail. And I hope we can really try to clarify what is possible with this kind of community and what it's achieved so far and what it's trying to achieve. That's sort of my goal here. And I think it'd be good if I can characterize how I discovered the community sort of generally, or at least how I discovered your content perhaps. So In early 2020, I found your content towards the start of the pandemic, and I felt very fortunate to have discovered it because your approach to discourse deeply resonated with me. More specifically, what I encountered was a Facebook post of yours in which you addressed some of the problems with conversation about the pandemic. And without going into the specifics of that post, it felt like your comments really crystallized my own issues that I had with most of the people in my life who were trying to navigate the complexities of the impending pandemic. I also saw in that post that in the comment section, there was the exact kind of discourse that I was actually looking for in my social circles. So I just want to say that I really admire what you're doing there, and I think it's very important. And it also seems to me that what you're doing on Facebook is sort of like helping build that community of rationalism. Is that something you're intending there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of it is self-centered. I just like having the sorts of people around me that can have the sorts of conversations that I want to have. But very much I lean into trying to make things explicit, trying to like explain how things work, at least as well as I understand them, trying to reinforce norms that I think will like help people be able to communicate with one another. Definitely, I put a lot of intentional attention on that.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. So that kind of leads nicely into the first general question I wanted to talk about, which is what is the rationalist community at the present moment? And I guess like, how did it start and all that? So would you be comfortable trying to sort of just describe generally what the rationalist community is right now?
Yeah, so it's a loosely allied group of largely online people. There are physical clusters in Berkeley, California, in New York, in Boston, in Australia, in the Czech Republic. There's sort of clusters all over the place. But in general, it's a largely online community. Historically, it traces back to a guy named Eliezer Yudkowsky and an online fan fiction called Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. But there are earlier roots than that. Eliezer was part of a mailing list of sort of interested amateur philosophers and mathematicians and programmers prior to the publishing of the fic that like brought in a bunch more people. And a lot of the people on that mailing list were drawing from work done by philosophers and psychologists over the last 100 years. There was a discipline called general semantics that looked at how language influences our understanding of the world. There was the work of Tversky and Kahneman in studying like human heuristics and biases. But basically, as all of this stuff has filtered through sort of like one group and the next group, and each group has tried to sort of crystallize it and boil it down and make it more accessible. The present day rationality community, or the rationalist community, is a bunch of people who've read a bunch of the works of Eliezer Yudkowsky and his friends and colleagues and sort of conversational opponents, and tapped into a lot of ideas about like what sorts of ways human cognition goes wrong. What are the differences between what we believe and what's actually true? And then sort of alongside that, what are the most important problems in the world? Like what are the dangers facing humanity? What might the future look like if things go well? What might the future look like if things go badly? The rationalist community is this collection of people that are interested in thinking about thinking for the sake of making the future as awesome as possible.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So I know that's all these are difficult questions, but so far, I mean, I think that really does clarify it as best as possible. So another sort of tricky question here is, I wonder if you could estimate the size of the rationalist community at the present moment. We could perhaps say worldwide, and then maybe like California specifically, or in each sort of like physical group.
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky because it's not a community that has anything like fences or gates. Like it's easy to tell who's on a football team because it's the people that, show up for practice and games and wear the jerseys. And there's certainly not any boundaries that clear for the rationalist community. But if you include sort of everybody who would self-identify as either rationalist or rationalist adjacent, like there's definitely certainly the like, oh, I don't know, I don't want to be like so identified with this group.
Yeah,
but
I was just going to ask about that also group as well.
If you include both the rationalists and the rationalist adjacent people, my guess is that you're looking at a group between between 1,000 and 5,000 people spread across the whole world. If you look at the more tight-knit community of like people who might show up at a party in Boston or New York or Berkeley, or all the people who have been to a workshop at the Center for Applied Rationality or something like that, I think sort of committed everyday rationalists, you're going to be more like 500 to 2,000. So like 500 to 2,000 for the smaller, narrower community where everybody kind of has heard the name of everybody else. And then 1,000 to 5,000 for the like broader spread out thing.
Okay. So yeah, I discovered this community and I felt like I kind of discovered it late. Actually, I should ask quickly, when did this mailing list that you referred to with Eliezer Yudkowsky and a number of other thinkers, when did that start out?
Yeah, I'm not certain. I think it was somewhere in the vicinity of like 2007 to 2011, somewhere around there. I know that, for instance, Anna Salomon, who's one of the leaders at the Center for Applied Rationality and one of the like more central members of the community, I'm pretty sure that Anna Salomon showed up sometime around like 2010 or 2012. And she was sort of one of the latecomers to the very earliest, most insular group. So, she's now one of the central founding members of the broader community, but would have considered herself a latecomer back at the time in 2010 or whatever.
Okay, interesting. So I wonder, like, because the way I discovered it was through Sam Harris's interview with Eliezer Yudkowsky. I just thought Yudkowsky's thoughts were very interesting about artificial intelligence, but they didn't talk about rationalism or rationality in any explicit way. And then I just Googled Eliezer and then found stuff he'd done and then found blogs he'd worked on and realized there was this community, but I never really had a firm understanding of what this community actually was. I felt like I just discovered sort of like another, almost like you discover an alien species, like they're speaking a specific, like another language, and everyone seems to kind of be on the same page, even when I often have no clue what they're saying, or at least at the time that was the case. I gradually am starting to learn the language and develop an understanding of how the conversation happens. But so at the time, though, I did care a lot about rationality. I was particularly interested through this little movement called the intellectual dark web, which I don't know if you know about it, but and I'm not sure if listeners know, but this was a small movement of public speakers who were very oriented around having explicitly healthy, rational discourse, even when they disagreed. So you had Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, which is a bit of an odd name to mention now in this context, but because he's changed and evolved in lots of ways. But he was there, Sam Harris, Eric Weinstein, Brett Weinstein. And I loved what these guys were doing. And then when I discovered the rationalist community, I realized, hang on a sec, there's a group that's been trying to do this for a really long time now. So I wonder if you guys felt like hipsters and you felt a little bit like under-recognized when movements like that were happening.
I don't think so. I don't think I've really encountered anybody who felt that way. The general take within the rationalist community is just like the more the merrier. Anytime we discover another group that's doing something parallel, or anytime somebody gets like clean discourse or good epistemic hygiene out into the public eye, we're just basically thrilled about it.
Okay, so I think we can just move into that second question, which is a very broad one as well. Why isn't it more popular? So I thought of a few different ways of sort of jumping into this question, but the first I thought of is that I was thinking about my experience discovering the community. So listening to Sam's podcast and then discovering Eliezer Yudkowsky and navigating through his name, just doing lots of Googling. And I think others might stumble into the rationalist community through similar explicitly rational content that they're engaging in. But I wonder why it's so hard to find anyways, because I still did have to sort of do lots of Googling and then find these blogs, and I never really immediately understood what the blogs were doing exactly, and they all seem slightly different in some way. So I wonder, why do you think it's hard to find?
Like, why is it hard to discover rationalist content, or?
Yeah, I guess so. Like in particular, this community where you have people explicitly thinking about rationalism and how to engage in it. Yeah, why is it not like just kind of a name that you can hear about casually and regularly?
Yeah, so I have a handful of thoughts on why that might be. Like, I think there are a bunch of little factors that sort of all relate. One factor is that a lot of the rationalists' dialogue or a lot of the rationalist discourse is on topics that people either aren't interested in or have like strong reactions to. like you could say that there's a lot of baggage that comes along with the current existing rationalist community. So for instance, there are groups out there called the Effective Altruists, people who are interested in like maximizing the usefulness of charitable donations, finding like the most effective charities and the most important causes. And they're an overlap with the rationalist community. But if you are, say, an animal rights activist who's focused on like finding the best ways to reduce animal suffering, and you bump into a bunch of rationalists who won't stop talking about how artificial intelligence is going to end everything, this might sort of turn you off of rationalism in general, because you've got, livestock that you're trying to save from suffering right now, and all of these people that are, pretty intelligent and talking in pretty cool and clever ways, like won't shut up and like let you focus on saving the livestock. They like want to drag you off into a corner and talk to you about the robots. Or like if you first get into it because your friends are pestering you that you have to read this Harry Potter fan fiction, and fan fiction is kind of like, it's a little like icky and low status and weird. So I think one reason that has kept the rationalist community from just sort of exploding and being popular is these like side connections to things that have their own baggage. Another piece of the puzzle, in my estimation, would be that it's really hard to sort of navigate the waters of saying like, hey, the way we're doing things is not great, and I think there are better ways that we could do things, and like I've tried a few ways that might be better. This can very easily slip into like, oh, so what you're saying is I'm dumb and bad and you're smart and good. And in my own experience, the vast, vast majority of rationalists do not actually have that attitude at all. Many of them try to push the term aspiring rationalist because they don't even want to make the claim of like, I'm not claiming that I'm actually rational. I'm just claiming that I'm really trying. But it's still tricky, I think, when people sort of have their defenses up of like, okay, am I going to be called out for being irrational? Am I going to be called out for poor discourse or something like that? And I do think it's reasonable for people to have that sort of knee-jerk reaction. As soon as somebody starts talking about doing things right versus doing things wrong, there's an immediate wariness that pops up. And I think that makes it tough sometimes for people to enter an existing community, especially if you show up on a subreddit or a Discord server or whatever, and you ask a question and somebody replies with like, go read this whole essay before I bother to answer your question. It's like, well, maybe not, maybe screw you. Mm-hmm. The last one is that this is sort of tricky, but there's a lot of, I want to say weaponry. I'm talking about sort of like words and social norms. But if you think about like the way that our politicians operate or the way that journalists operate, there's a lot of weaponry that works in the social space that is not based on truth or accuracy, but is nevertheless like devastatingly effective. You can get followers, you can get money, you can get power, you can get attention by lying or by being deceitful or by playing on people's emotions and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that the rationalists are trying to do is disarm some of this weaponry. They're trying to say, hey, even though, these emotional ploys work on people, we shouldn't use them because they're not true. Even though this chart gets engagement and gets clicks and went viral, the information is false, so we shouldn't use it. And there's a way in which if you're a group that is sort of unilaterally disarming in a broader context culture where everybody is still using all the weapons, there's sort of a cap on how far you can spread and how effective you can be, not just because other people will keep using those weapons, but because a lot of your recruits or your potential recruits, people who might join your movement, won't want to put those weapons down and become locally less effective with just the promise that, yeah, but if we all do this, eventually we'll all be more effective as a group.
Yeah, it strikes me as a catch-22. It's sort of like you need people to be somewhat already rationalists to be rationalists, because they have to value, throwing away these very useful tools that are not necessarily fair if you're trying to be a rationalist. There are a couple,
or even being willing to admit like that you, like for instance, you can't just believe whatever you want to believe.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely still a view that is pushed very hard. And I definitely have encountered that too, as I've sort of I've discovered the rationalist community, and then I've wanted to spread it through this perfectly candid view that most people I know say that they want to be rationalists. And then when I found this community, I'm like, all right, let me show them that there are other people doing it. And then they have all these strange pushbacks, very much like that. There are a few other things you touched on that really resonate with me, like the fact that some people are trying to use the term aspiring rationalist is very interesting to me. I didn't really know that was a thing that people are trying, but it makes sense to me because I have friends who really didn't like the idea of people calling themselves rationalists. Like as soon as I mentioned that, they were like, oh, so these people think they're perfectly rational. And I was like, isn't that a non sequitur? Like that doesn't necessarily mean they think they're perfect at it. But I don't know, maybe I was misunderstanding. And another element, you mentioned some niche topics like bringing up Harry Potter, the Harry Potter fan fiction as a way of bringing people in, which it is an incredibly important text for doing that. There's also this element I find where the rationalist community has a broad range of eclectic like topics that it will cover, and the people involved in it will have opinions or expertise in such a broad range of things. And every movement I can think of that really draws success, it benefits from the fact that it's very coherently like focused on one thing, where like it'll be within one topic, within one realm. You know, there are religions, there are cultural movements, and all of these things, when they're simplified and like unified on one point or message or topic, it's really easy for people to be like, okay, I'm in on that. But when the topic is rationalism, it seems to me that it inherently covers everything in a way. It's like, okay, this can now be, it's like a meta movement rather than just a movement. And that seems, I think, maybe harder for people to actually just even comprehend and realize can be a movement itself. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that frequently pops up around the sort of like, what are the boundaries of the rationalist community, or what should the boundaries of the rationalist community be? One of the ideas that frequently pops up is, why don't we make a bunch of little splinter communities that are each more tightly focused on the thing that they're actually trying to do, rather than like everybody trying to be inclusive of everybody and then there sort of being a diffuse focus. That never really takes off, but I see a lot of appeal to that. The idea of like an archipelago of sort of allied friendly groups that are each trying to do their own thing. You somewhat see that with the rationalist community and the effective altruist community and the artificial intelligence safety communities being three separate groups that allow themselves to overlap and be friendly. But yeah, even within each of those broad umbrellas, there's a lot of sort of diffusion and confusion and not a lot of clarity about like, well, what does it take to be a member of this group?
Right. I think that explains a lot of why I struggled to even just get into the community, because I already cared about rationalism. But then if I started to discover the community, I'd notice specific conversations littered throughout. Everywhere I looked, it would be like, there's one really specific conversation. They're getting very deep into that topic. Then there's another one. And each time it was like, okay, I would have to figure out, is this something I can even start to engage in now? Do I even have any of the research done to even think about this? So sometimes I'd have to just discard a certain conversation, be like, I can't think about that right now.
Yeah, put it on the list.
Exactly. So the list is growing. But I want to pull back a little bit before we move through this question still, because there are a lot of other ways we can think about this. There's one thing I think is important to ask, which is, how much has the community grown in the time that you've been involved? Have you noticed there's been a particular period of like significant growth or more growth than other times?
I think between something like 2013 and 2016, the rationalist community saw its biggest influx, especially because that was the period in which the Harry Potter fan fiction was being published online. I think since then, since around the time that I showed up, there's been much more of just like a slow and steady growth, where people will come across the internet groups, like on subreddits and Discord servers and so forth. People will go to Less Wrong, which is a web forum where people people post essays and there's online discussion.
Yeah, I would have thought my sort of intuition was that it would be an exponential growth because of social media. I thought that, my hope at least, I think it was wishful thinking to some significant degree, but I was hoping that because the way I discovered it was Facebook, and I don't even engage in other social media, but I was hoping that, Facebook's algorithms and Instagrams and all those other algorithms would be promoting this to the people who might truly be interested. And then I assumed that would just draw in the most people right now than ever before. And I thought maybe that would create a bit of a challenge for the community to figure out, okay, how do we make sure that people who are joining are sincerely being rationalists or just wanting to call themselves rationalists and actually don't understand anything we're talking about? Is that a concern that ever arises?
It's definitely a concern that arises for me personally. I've had like lots of debates and discussions and trying to figure out how to strategize around that. I think it occurs as a concern to a small number of the like central rationalist figures, but I don't think anything ever really particularly gets done about it. One of the things that the rationalist community doesn't want to do is be like super gatekeepery or like lose out on interesting and effective people because they were turned off or turned away right at the outset. And there's also a sub thread of like a lot of the people in the rationalist community are pretty weird. And it strives to be cosmopolitan because a lot of the people are like, well, I was weird and didn't like getting, rebuffed or excluded because of my weirdness. So I'll try not to, make it unwelcoming for other weird people coming in. But yeah, I don't know, the concept of like rationalist in name only, or like the rationalist social group, as opposed to the people that are actually trying to put forth effort. That's definitely one of the tensions within the community that sort of has been around for a while and continues to crop up. And in both directions too. Like there are lots of people that, it's not just rationalists being like, ugh, these people who claim to be rationalists but aren't. There's also a lot of people that, for instance, I personally would point at them and be like, I think that person's doing a lot of this right. I think they're doing clear thinking. I think they're doing good discourse. But then those people are like, yeah, I don't feel welcome in the rationalist community. I feel judged and I feel like I'm not hitting the shibboleths. And I feel like if I dared to claim that I was a rationalist, people would pile on me and like insult me and stuff. And, so from both directions, the sort of uneasy tension between what does it take to be a rationalist, it exists.
Yeah, see, I'm recently been a little bit concerned that it's possible that the only way that a community like this could genuinely grow into like a serious movement, like a large scale cultural movement, would be if you just have to embrace people who aren't doing it well, but they're popularizing the name of it effectively. I hope I'm wrong about that. I really don't know how things will evolve, especially as social media continues to evolve. But that's something I'm always worried about. It's like maybe we just need like famous people saying they're rationalists, and then that's just going to be the key to making this a serious movement, because I think it's so important that we explicitly talk about it. But in any case, this actually really does tie into the next way I wanted to ask this question of the popularity, which is basically most people I meet, they genuinely seem to care about rationalism. They care about being rational, and they highly esteem it. I rarely meet people who say that rationalism is inherently impossible or illogical. I do meet those people, but it's pretty rare, and usually it doesn't seem like they've thought about it that much. But most people I meet, if I ask them, they'll say, yeah, I want to be rational, level-headed. And yet they have no clue that there's a community out there that focuses on that. And I don't think they even are in thinking that that's something they could try looking up or researching. So why do you think people so often fail to walk the walk when it comes to like being a rational person?
So one of the things is that a lot of the like understanding of psychology in sort of pop culture, like the Malcolm Gladwell type stuff, the stuff that shows up on NPR, you'll all the time see this incredibly depressing research that's like, hey, we've discovered a new way that humans screw up when they think. And guess what? Even the doctors make this mistake, and even the economists make this mistake. And there's often this message of sort of hopelessness of like, everybody's just like crazy biased and crazy confused. And, a lot of the current political movements center around people sort of labeling each other as biased or confused. And so I think there's a sort of learned helplessness. It just doesn't occur to many people that there is actually low-hanging fruit out there, and that if you just do the following 12 things, take a year and spend like 1 month, each month try a new one of these 12 things, that you can actually make a huge dent in your own like struggles with level-headedness and reason and so forth. I think people just don't know to hope. I don't think there's good messaging around like, yeah, you can actually clean up your thinking and it's not that hard.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I never really thought about it in terms of like just what kind of psychology is actually published. Now that I really think about it, yeah, psychology is generally pretty discouraging. The psychology that is publicized better. Yeah. There is like small little psychology that will say things like you only use 10% of your brain and you have so much potential, which is just a complete falsehood, but that catches on too. But I don't hear about those kinds of things so much, and certainly not about ways of overriding your natural biases that are certainly there. And the research is very helpful in finding those biases. But yeah, very little research and publicity about how humans are so good at also being able to override things like that, overriding their sort of instincts, I guess.
Yeah, I think one of the things that gets missed is that, I mean, at the moment, we're basically all stuck with our hardware. Like our brains are the way they are. There's a little bit that can be done with pharmacology and chemicals and so forth. For the most part, our brains are what they are. But our software is hugely important. I mean, the vast majority of human development over the last two millennia has been software development, right? The concept of agriculture, the ideas in various languages, engineering, all of that. And similarly, there are software upgrades that we can do both in our own thinking and in how we interact with others. And I think people just don't pay much attention to the fact that they could just swap in a new program. Instead of saying X, I could say Y, and like this would actually just be better. People just don't know that. They're not told that in school. They're not told that by their parents. Yeah.
It also strikes me that when that is stated, it's often in like, BS self-help things where they'll just be telling you, here's how you can be happy and fulfilled in life. And first of all, that's just oriented around your own happiness. It's not necessarily oriented around how you can benefit the world around you best. And it also is often just not even very legitimate. It's just kind of like, here, we can make you super happy. And then people will bite on that, but they won't necessarily bite on something that says, we can make you super logical and effective at like reasoning.
Or even worse, we can give you a 6% improvement in your logic and reason. Like the actual true thing is like, hey, if you try this way of thinking over that one, you will be marginally better all the time. And like people not even like, who's going to spend an hour trying to get a 3% improvement if they haven't even really thought about how big a 3% improvement is? There's a sort of circular problem, like you were saying earlier. In order to be interested in rationalism, you kind of already need some sort of precursor. If you're the sort of person whose ears perk up when somebody says a 3% improvement in your rationality, you're kind of already there. And it's hard to figure out how to turn the average person into the sort of person whose ears will perk up when they hear about a possible 3% improvement.
This also interestingly connects to an issue that I've had with marketing as a general concept, which perhaps this is a conversation for another time, but I've always been sort of disappointed that marketing is so often like laced with dishonesty or manipulation. And if you're going to market a rationalist community in the traditional fashion, you're going to be pretty dishonest. You're going to say like, oh, your life's going to be so much better from this. And you're going to like love this community. People report being so much happier after discovering this community. And those things might be half true or even 75% true, but they're not. There's always that sort of coercion going on in, I guess, traditional marketing styles. But that's a complicated
There's very
area.
much a nice guys finish last problem with rationalists marketing themselves in rationalist terms.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So another question I have, which touches on all of this, is just why don't these movements, like when they become movements, stick? And I'm particularly thinking of something like the intellectual dark web, because it was full of highly influential popular names. Like Jordan Peterson has a massive following, Ben Shapiro too. Dave Rubin was developing a huge following. Sam Harris has always, like for a long time, had a very large following. And yet all of these speakers, when initially trying to give themselves a name and a group and say, hey, we're going to have really good level-headed conversation, even though we disagree on like a ton of different topics, that just dissipated almost immediately before it even started almost. It was pretty bizarre. And then all of these different speakers kind of just went their own directions. So I wonder, do you have any ideas on why these kinds of movements don't gain momentum more easily and more public endorsement, I guess?
Yeah, I don't have any sort of prior like cached thoughts, but some things that occur to me. One is the distinction between like when you mention this list of names, it makes me think of like the soccer community, like the soccer and football community, where those names would be like the world famous players. And then everybody else is the millions of fans and people playing in their backyard. And there's a way in which, I don't know, it doesn't matter how good the best in the world soccer players get, it's not going to suddenly cause the whole world to become actually really good at soccer. It's just like too easy to have it be a spectator sport, too easy to have people sort of just passively piggyback on what a small number of people are doing. That's one thing that pops into my head as a fragment of an explanation. And then another piece I think is just that it's hard. Like one of my common complaints toward rationalists in general, one of the things that I sort of become a stickler on Facebook is like, listen, it really doesn't matter if you do this stuff right 95% of the time. If like the 5% of the time that you do it wrong is like the most important 5%, like if you skip over it when it's most inconvenient, that's actually probably when it like would have mattered most for you to get this stuff right. Like if you're rationalist all the time, except when you're really triggered and angry and fighting with your boss or with your romantic partner or whatever, like that's the moment when you really need it. And it's just really easy for people to not use it when it matters, not use it when it counts. It's really tempting to pick those weapons back up at the most opportune moment. And then sort of like, not having picked up those weapons for 95 days in a row doesn't really matter when you picked it up on the one day that you got in a fight. It's like, well.
Yeah, I that touches on something that I really think is important, which is, and this is definitely a debatable view, and I've met tons of people who debate this with me all the time, which is just how toxic emotion is. Like, I really do think at this point that emotion is not helpful. Like, it's only helpful if you're constantly keeping track of it and you know what your emotion, if you're feeling, and you know how it's affecting you. But I know a lot of people who believe that emotion is like guiding everything. They think that everything people do is guided by emotion. And that's like an important thing. They even will argue to me that I only care about rationalism through an emotional like attachment to it. And I think that's a confusion, but also, yeah, it reminds me that people really value their emotions. Even if you're feeling an emotion that doesn't feel good actively in the moment, you still value it in that moment. It's like, no, this is my anger. This is my sadness. I'm upset right now. And I want to tell everybody. So as soon as you're emotional and you're not self-aware about the emotion, I think it has this effect where it just completely shifts all of your thinking, and you just want, and the emotion is just everything that matters. It's the only thing that matters in that moment.
Yeah, so I think my take on emotion is close to, but a little bit shifted from yours. I think in my language, what you just said, if I was to translate it, I think what you were just saying is the problem is when you let the emotion have the steering wheel. I personally find emotion to be tremendously valuable, both as a source of information, like as a heads up about what's going on, and also as a source of motivation and fuel. But yeah, I agree that like it's like sort of how, you can be mad at somebody, but it's not okay to hit them. There's an analogous thing with almost every emotion. Like, oh, this emotion is probably there for a reason. It's probably good that you're feeling it. It's probably helping you. But like what you do with it should be constrained by some larger policy, right? No matter how mad you get, it's usually not a good idea to hit somebody. Similarly, no matter how scared you are, that doesn't necessarily mean that the thing you're scared of is actually real or proportional. Like people talk about how like child abductions are down since the 50s, but there's this perception that the world is more dangerous because you now hear about every child abduction anywhere in the country. It ends up on the news and everybody hears about it. There's a thing there about like, oh yeah, I'm afraid and anxious. The thing to do there is to pause and be like, okay, what is this fear and anxiety doing? What is it for? okay, the fear and anxiety is there to like remind me to protect, my children or kids around me. But like, what are the actual threats? I need to actually pause and think about, okay, what sort of action is called for here and what's effective and like, what are the various trade-offs and what are the costs? Whereas if you just go with your gut and lock your kids inside so they don't get kidnapped and then they never go outside and they never have fun. Yeah, that's sort of like letting the emotion drive is very popular. A lot of people never question it. They never stop to ask themselves, why do I feel what I feel? And are my feelings appropriate? Not are they good or bad? Like, I don't think it really makes sense to ask whether your feelings are good or bad, but sort of, are they appropriate to the information coming in? And are the actions that my feelings want me to take appropriate, going out?
Right. Yeah. I'm thinking now, like emotion. Yeah. Emotion is extremely informative, but it's like helpful through that information. It's not necessarily helpful in like feeding your actions. It will feed your information that might guide your actions, but the information is the helpful part, not necessarily just what actions they tell you to do.
Exactly.
And like you said, it's important to also give attention to the opposite side, which is, at some point you could think emotion is so bad that you don't give credit to any of your emotions. And then you could end up getting walked all over in your life. You get upset about someone taking advantage of you at work. And then you say, well, it's okay. It's fine. There's no need in getting angry. It's a pointless emotion. And then you're not dealing with that situation at all. You're just like, being mistreated. And that happens very often for sure. So I want to jump back a little bit because you were talking about the difficulty in, I guess when emotion got brought up because you're talking about the difficulty in staying rational. There's another element of difficulty, I think, in becoming more rational or engaging with the rationalist community, which has to do with like the complexity of the discourse. Like the friends of mine whom I deem most rational, people with whom I already was kind of having the conversations I see in the rationalist community to some degree, not perfectly, but those guys and gals, I showed them the rationalist community, and many of them reacted saying that they felt like the rationalist community was overcomplicating simple ideas and using fancy, complicated language that just made it more confusing. And I am not sure if they're right about this. It probably happens sometimes, but I don't know if that's a general trend in the rationalist community. But I can see how that would gatekeep against people who have a sincere interest in this. And then they think, oh, this is just pretentious and overcomplicated. I'm just getting confused. Do you think that's a real legitimate effect and a trend in the rationalist community?
I definitely think that there is something to be said for like barriers to entry. This is part of why H.P. Moore was so popular. The Harry Potter fan fiction, Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. Part of why it's so popular is that it, slowly takes you step by step through the story, introducing you to concept after concept and layering them in. At the Center for Applied Rationality, at the workshops, we had a glossary in the handbook. We're like, look, if somebody says some jargon that just goes right over your head and you don't feel like pausing the conversation to ask, we put a glossary in the back that like,
that's awesome.
We're sorry that there even has to be a glossary, but at least it's there for you if you want it. I think that matters, but I think that I'm sort of unwilling to give up fine distinctions. Like if you imagine a single individual growing up from being a toddler to being a child to being a teenager to being a grown up, the ability to like hold finer and finer distinctions, the ability to see finer and finer distinctions is crucial to like an individual human's evolution, right? Like when you're a toddler, you think that if mom takes the cake away from you, mom hates you. And like being able to realize that like, nope, mom loves me and is taking away the cake. Like being able to distinguish these two things is critical. It's hugely important, right? Being able to distinguish that just because someone disagrees with me doesn't mean that they're bad or dumb or wrong. And on a higher level, I think this is what the rationality community is doing with a lot of its jargon and terminology. I think when I hear like your friends being like, oh, they're just overcomplicating this simple thing, I think sometimes that is the case. Sometimes I read essays on less wrong or whatever, and I too get the reaction of like, this is not as complicated as this person is making it out to be. Mm. But often what's happening is that the onlooker, the reader, the audience really thinks that there is just one thing there. And there really are actually two different things. And the person is trying to teach you and trying to teach themselves to be able to tease apart these subtle distinctions. And then once you've teased apart these two things, you put a label on this one, you put a label on that one, suddenly you have more jargon. And there is a cost to the jargon. But the good thing that's going on is being able to capture these ever more subtle and intricate concepts and being able to layer them into your thinking. And I don't think the rationalist community always makes the right trade-off in terms of being accessible and having low barriers to entry versus being able to track all the fine distinctions. But I certainly think that I wouldn't trade my ability to track these fine distinctions to get more people. Like if it was, it's sort of like, if I can duck into an analogy real quick.
Absolutely.
I took Taekwondo as a teenager, and when I started at my Taekwondo academy, it was a small, hardcore academy led by a guy who came from Korea. Master Lee was from Korean. He'd like imported, he'd learned English. He'd set up his small academy. There were maybe 5 or 10 instructors under Master Lee. There were maybe 100 students total. And it was highly disciplined and really good. And eventually the academy shifted to more of a like open, family friendly, money making after school thing. Hundreds and hundreds of students, dozens of instructors, a much more open model. And both models work, but I'm not convinced that the second thing was better for someone who wants to learn Taekwondo. Like as I was going through the academy when it was small and tight knit and hardcore, I really learned the martial art quite intimately and quite deeply. And, a decade later, the thriving business that is good for the community and good for families and everything, it's a different good. And similarly with the rationalist community, I think there's this tension between making it more open and more accessible such that you could get an influx of thousands of people that are getting sort of a weaker, more diluted, more simplified version of it versus like, well, you know what? This sort of heap of jargon is a big hurdle to entry, and we're going to lose some good people who don't bother to climb over it. But like, honestly, the jargon itself is important, and like the handful of people that do bother to digest it all are going to be much, much better. I think there really is a sort of sliding dichotomy there where you can either be very small and very hardcore and have a group of like very extremely skilled individuals, or you can slide all the way over to the like pop culture, popular version where you only get like 1 or 2 important pieces of the thing, but they're accessible to everyone. And every point in between. I'm not sure what the optimal point is between those extremes. And I think there are debates and disagreements within the community about what the optimal point is. And I think that people who bounce off the rationalist community also often have opinions about, person X will be like, yeah, it would have been better if things were 10% more accessible. But in the imagined world where things were 10% more accessible, there's a person Y who bounces off and is like, I think it would have been better if things were 10% more accessible. And it's just really hard to know where the line should be.
Yeah, absolutely. The analogy that came to mind for me was chess, actually, because I recently got into chess and I'm not naturally gifted at chess whatsoever. So I was very like, just it didn't come naturally to me at all. And early on, I was frustrated and confused and overwhelmed and a little bit nervous that I just would never be able to get the hang of this. But what I had to do was dig into the jargon. I actually had to watch lesson videos that were very long, like hour-long videos, many of them. And I would learn tons of jargon. And it helped so much to be able to give a name to each of the strategies or just like setups that you might notice. Every time there was a name for something, a term, it was jargon, but it was unbelievably helpful because then every time I played chess, I would have a name for that thing. And that's how I would notice how to react to it or what to actually try in the situation. And also this analogy connects to chess further because chess is becoming incredibly popular these days. And then you have something like, I can't remember what it's called now, The Queen's Gambit, like a Netflix show where I know people who watched it and I think they care about chess. And then after they watched it, they know nothing about chess. Didn't learn anything about it. Whereas I got really deep into chess, but it's because I dug into jargon like intensely. And so, yeah, it is hard work and the language is incredibly useful. It just in terms of learning something, when you can give a name to a concept And it just makes it easier to notice it. Like our brains are so oriented, I guess, around language, and we've everything, our brains perhaps even evolved with the use of language. And so using language is incredibly useful for just learning things and becoming more level-headed and rational.
Yeah, this is where like you might be interested in to look into the history of the word genocide, which was invented by a specific person who then campaigned to be like, this word needs to be popularized and recognized. And like, I need the UN to acknowledge that this word is a thing. And, you know, now we sort of take the word genocide for granted. The idea that there is a concept there. 100 years ago, we didn't have that concept. And as a result, the thing went unrecognized and was much harder to think about and much harder to address and deal with. This is where I think the rationalist community would benefit from looking at something like the martial arts tradition or whatever. But like what martial arts academies do is they have this excellent sort of treadmill with repeated asks followed by rewards. You know, you show up, you learn 2 kicks and 2 punches, and then they give you a white belt. And then you learn a few more kicks and a few more punches, and they reward you with a yellow belt and status. And also now you get to turn around and help the white belts learn a thing. There's this sort of like progressive reward for each step. The rationalist community does not have this. There's no like, hey, here are the first 3 things you should learn. And once you learn those 3 things, you will be like patted on the back and welcomed into certain conversations. And that'll make it easier to learn the next 3 things. There's no progression of content available in the rationalist community, really. There's just these massive sprawling sequences of blog posts, which, you know, you sort of have to be self-motivated to go after them. If you're not self-motivated, you will likely just give up after the 3rd obtuse, dense essay. And that's really a shame.
Yeah, it sounds like we have a great idea for an app there. That does sound excellent. Something like that would help me out so much. So I think it would help just like most people out, essentially, to just navigate. There are people who can just read the essays and just, they're so interested that they can read these essays carefully, maybe multiple times if they have to, get the hang of all the terms. They don't need some sort of like system where they're building up their vocabulary and comprehension. But I think most people probably do. And I think it would be a great idea. There's another interesting factor here relating to the jargon, which is a lot of the posts, sometimes they also might seem longer than they need to be. So in addition to having more words and maybe overcomplicating ideas, or that's what it looks like to some readers, also they might be like, why am I still reading about this? Didn't they already kind of make the point? But I noticed that I think there's an element of like it being a creative process, being rational. Like sometimes when, like I certainly find, and when I read your content too, when I'm trying to make sense of a concept, sometimes I just need to try different sentences and say them and then maybe reframe it, maybe mess around with punctuation and spacing of even just what I've written. And that genuinely helps me get to the central idea. And maybe it's not incredibly efficient, but it's the only way I can actually get to the main idea that I mean to say, but don't really know what it is. So do you think there's a big element of like creativity to just the process of speaking rationally?
Yeah, 100%. There's a common saying in the parkour community: nobody can teach you parkour. They can just help you as you teach yourself. There's very much a thing where like if a given rationalist concept lives in my head as sort of this branching tree that reaches out and connects to all sorts of other ideas. And it's not possible for me to just copy paste that tree straight into someone else's head, right? In order to get somebody to really deeply understand a given rationalist concept, what I have to do is hand them a seed, let them embed that seed in their own understanding somewhere, and then like help them water it and grow it and have it branch out and connect other things. This is, I think, why a lot of the essays are so meandering, is what they're trying to do is get the person to make all the relevant connections rather than just having the concept of representativeness heuristic just dropped into a dusty drawer in the back of their mind somewhere.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that it does explain a lot. So for anybody who's listening, if you're experiencing what I experienced extensively, which is you're reading these essays and you're intimidated and confused by jargon, and then you're starting to get maybe mentally exhausted because you're reading for so long, like patience and just like trust in the process and recognizing that it's creative. It's a creative process to some degree. And it really requires individualizing the concept. So making it so you understand it your own way. And yeah, just taking the time to really read through these long pieces. It's worth it. And it's not just pretentious every time. It can be, but it definitely isn't always.
And also trusting your feelings of exhaustion. If you're reading a 10,000 word essay and you're tired and grumpy, stop reading. Pick it up again tomorrow.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I was listening to Eliezer Yudkowsky's book, Rationality from AI to Zombies. I was listening to the audiobook version of it, and that certainly happened to me so many times because it's like truly very complex ideas, ones that I had never really encountered, only in minor ways, but like he's really crystallizing so many ideas that I never truly encountered so clearly. And so it's a lot of information, and definitely re-listening to sections was necessary, 100%. Taking notes, but it had to be a patient process, and understanding that it also is sort of a creative process too. I think that helped me a lot.
I sort of feel guilty and embarrassed that one of my most popular essays, like most widely read essays, in defense of Punchbug, is 14,000 words, and I'm like embarrassed that it's 14,000 words. And I tried to at least break it up into chunks so that people could read it, like read one section one day and then come back to it another day. But sometimes there's just so many pieces that all have to click together at once. It's like, I'm sorry. It's like those 3D puzzles made of all the like little plastic pieces where you kind of have to hold 7 different pieces at once while you click the last one in. And it's like, I'm really sorry that I have to throw 7 things at you all at the same time, but like, you got to just sort of hold them all at once. And I apologize, but that's the way it is sometimes.
Yeah, I think that essay is actually a perfect example of these ideas. So if any listeners haven't read that or are curious about Duncan Sabien's work, definitely that's a great one to check out. So the broader question I have here, which is one that I kept going to when I was talking to my friends about this topic, and once we really dug deeper into why my friends were not embracing the rationalist community at all, we started to talk about just what the value of public discourse is generally. Because my friends kept sort of referring to the rationalist community as just people talking about stuff. And they just couldn't get over the fact that that's what they were seeing. And it wasn't really that different, they thought, from standard discourse you see on social media. And I kept trying to dig into this and be like, well, don't you think it is different though? Like if you read a standard social media conversation in the comments, surely you see a vast difference from that and the conversations you're seeing in these comments. But every time I brought that up, they would sort of be dismissive and just say, well, it doesn't matter. It's just random people talking anyways. So this brought me to just this fundamental question, which is what is the value of public discourse? Because they kind of argued that ultimately the world is only going to benefit from luck and, maybe voting or whatever, and the government just making choices and science making choices, but public discourse isn't really doing anything. And I think that's a very pessimistic view, and I definitely don't agree with it at the moment, but it's not something I ever really thought about, and maybe it's something I should think about more. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so I do think that there's something like a limit to how much public discourse is going to affect the whole mass of humanity. I don't think that rationalist discourse is going to take over the entire United States population, for instance. I don't think that we're going to be able to get the 50th percentile or even the 70th percentile responsible person to switch over to sort of rationalist ways of thinking and speaking. I do think, though, that there's tremendous value in something like gardens or subcultures. I think that you can get small enclaves where real significant progress can happen that wouldn't have happened in the broader public sphere. And I think that that real significant progress can then leak out. For instance, there are rationalists, like some of the Berkeley rationalists and New York rationalists are upstream of whole multi-million-dollar orgs in the field of artificial intelligence. There are entire organizations, multiple organizations that exist today that would not have come into existence were it not for the rationalist community and their discourse. Similarly, there are, I believe, tens of millions of dollars of charitable donations. I could be off. It could just be millions, but still millions of dollars of charitable donations that are being funneled toward effective causes as a result of the effective altruism movement, which
Right.
has strong ties to the rationalist movement. So there are things that happen sort of incubated. There are like small enclaves that incubate these ideas, come up with actions, and then export those actions back out into the broader world. And they are, in fact, impacting the broader world in a very real way, especially in moments of confusion and crisis. The rationalist community did better than most world governments when it came to dealing with COVID-19. By March of 2020, the rationalist community was mobilized, doing things like sourcing medical equipment and funneling it to where it needed to be, setting up recovery tents in case people got sick, informing people about what sorts of personal protective equipment would work and what wouldn't, based on like concrete, understandable models of what we knew about the virus at the time. Not every year is going to be like 2020. In everyday humdrum, day in, day out living, rationality doesn't actually make much of a difference. But it's like a seatbelt. You practice wearing it when it doesn't matter so that you don't forget to wear it when it does. And this like just public discourse, COVID-19 is a great example of how the just a bunch of people talking turned out to outperform basically everyone in the world. I think approximately no rationalists got COVID-19. There might be like a small handful in the entire, broader 5,000 people. I would be surprised if more than 50 caught COVID-19 at all. And that's that sort of thing. We're hoping to have that same sort of impact when it comes to things like global poverty, global warming, artificial intelligence X-risk. All of these places are places where we believe that thinking about how to think and actually getting it right will, in fact, have a cumulative impact.
Wow. Yeah, that's an awesome example. One that I didn't really know about this. I saw excellent conversation around the pandemic from the rationalist community, but that was nothing surprising to me. But that's amazing to see that it had direct, concrete impacts on the real world. There are a few ways of looking at this that I find important. Like, I think the mechanics of how a rational discourse is going to impact the world is just way less obvious than sort of more superficial public discourse. And I think a good comparison might be to something like BLM, which is like BLM is a slogan, it's a catchphrase, but it's very effective at spreading awareness. And there's certain social public discourse movements that are excellent at spreading awareness. And the friends of mine who are dismissive of the rationalist community's discourse are very much in favor of those kinds of things, like just a slogan like Black Lives Matter and how much it's going to actually impact the world because it spreads awareness. But what rationalist discourse does is it's not necessarily just spreading awareness. I think it's more like it creates ideas. It does two things, I think. It informs the direction in which research might go. So if any scientists are hearing about this conversation through family, friends, whatever, or on social media, people engaging in research, they might not even notice it, but I think those ideas will be in their minds. And then later on, they'll be like, wait, this might be something I should mention to my coworkers and see if we can research this. And that's artificial intelligence, like you brought up, is a great example. And then also, yeah, it's like the seatbelt thing you said. It's more like a system of engaging with conversation. So it's not going to be obvious that it's changing the world, but there are going to be certainly ways that it changes the world. It's just you have to look a little bit closer and with a little bit more nuance to see how it's influencing the actual real world, I think.
Yeah, that's the hope anyway.
Right. Okay, so I have this last question here. This final question on the rationalist community, I can think of two ways of framing it. The first being, if you had to list a few concrete flaws with the current rationalist community, what would they be? And the other way of framing this would be, what do you think the rationalist community should look like? Like, what would be the best version of a rationalist community?
I mean, I think that the key disclaimer that I want to put on this is just that this is my answer. Like, this is just me, Duncan Sabien, and I am just a guy. And there are people who are competent and intelligent and capable who would have their own answer that is very different from mine. But I sort of view it as like, if you're trying to be a rationalist community, like if that's actually the thing that you're trying to do, what's the archetype of a rationalist community supposed to look like? in my view, we know a lot of things about how conversation goes wrong, how thinking goes wrong, and we're really lagging behind on execution. In my view, the proper rationalist community would do much more of like self-reinforcement and self-policing on clear, concrete norms of thinking and reasoning. And I don't mean like a call-out culture. Like there is this attractor that humans unfortunately slide into where, you know, you codify 10 things and then you just get this circular firing squad of people. Well, you did this that was irrational. Well, you did that was irrational. Yeah. I think it's possible to dodge that with, I think like one of the norms that could be enforced is a like, how do we check each other norm? But I think that the rationalist community has a bunch of tools that it just doesn't really pick up very often. And I think that the rationalist community sort of grants its members license and permission to do things that we all know we shouldn't, and do things that we explicitly say we shouldn't, but like, we just let it slide because it's my friend, or like, because it would be awkward. And I think that if you're going to try to do rationalism correctly, you should try to do it correctly. And like smaller groups of rationalists getting together and forming smaller discussion centers where like they actually adhere to discourse norms and they actually check one another's evidence and claims, and they actually make bets, and then they actually pay each other if those bets turn out one way or the other. I think more of that is how the rationalist community should go.
I'm also thinking like along those lines, might be worth mentioning, at least I would want to mention as someone who's a bit of an outsider and sort of has experience sort of trying to jump into the rationalist community and engage with the conversations. Maybe something like an explicit effort to not moralize too much, or because the rationalist community, one of its principles is that irrational conversation is highly problematic. So of course we understand that it's problem in the world. It has very negative consequences, but at the same time, when you accuse someone of being irrational or making a rational error, I think it's important to like highlight when you're doing that. Oh, but I don't mean you're a bad person. You're doing something that I think is a problem, but I understand that many people do that. It's very it's fair. It's just a mistake. And, you know, in a loving fashion saying, you know, you made a bit of a mistake there in my view. I could be wrong. Like maybe just like lacing it with love and affection and understanding.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. And in fact, that's a place where like I myself could do better, like in reducing the sort of how much moralizing is happening, or like how much do people feel like their fundamental character is on trial or at stake. Again, popping back to the metaphor of martial arts, like if you're learning how to do a certain kind of spinning kick in martial arts, there's no moral, like you tried it and like, you didn't do it right. Like you're usually not, you don't feel at risk of being called a bad person because you didn't do the kick right. It's just like, you still need to practice that kick a little more. And I think something like that attitude ported over, it's just really good to take the pressure off in that sense, like to make failure more okay, and to constantly be practicing the movement of recovering from failure. So that you're not afraid to do anything lest you screw up. And you don't get stuck down when you do fail. You don't get like overwhelmed with guilt or remorse. It's like, nope, this is what we always do. We screw up and then we practice, not screwing up next time. I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle.
That's a great way to put it. I also want to just mention to listeners, because I have experience with feeling that fear. Like, there's also an Ottawa-based, that's where I live, and there's an Ottawa-based rationalist community. And when I was getting involved with that community, I had a lot of anxiety, and that's a normal thing when you're, I think, just getting involved with this new social group and you don't know any of them, and you're just going to like go to a meeting and see all these people and you have to introduce yourself. And so that's a big thing already. Yeah. But behind all of that, I eventually noticed that I had this fear that I would make a rational mistake, or like a reasoning error or a logical error in something I was saying, and I would be considered like not right for the group, or one of the bad people, one of the people who's messing things up and a problem. And that ultimately was completely unfounded. I now feel very comfortable talking to these guys, and I've never once felt like I was being shamed or criticized. Like that doesn't really happen. So I want to say to listeners, if you're trying out a community like this and you're intimidated and you feel a little bit scared that you're going to be thought of as a bad person for making mistakes, it's good to just try to just jump in, because a lot of that is just, it's an understandable natural fear, but the pause, like, you might notice that happen once in a blue moon, but for the most part, you'll feel a lot of encouragement from others who've been through that too. We all make logical mistakes, and that's just part of the process.
And still do. All the rationalists that are worth knowing lead with their own flaws all the time.
Yeah.
Almost every single lecture at a CFAR workshop starts with the instructor talking about a time that they screwed up or were dumb, and how that led them to start asking questions and poking around and, figuring it out. Eliezer Yudkowsky constantly is like, oh, nope, never mind. Turns out I was wrong. And that's like, it's not even notable. People are like, oh, cool. Now we can move forward.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things, like one of the best things I saw from that community.
Yeah. And as you point out, it's not universal. Sometimes, it is a broad community. There's lots of people, but the majority of the people who are at the core of it, the majority of the people who've been around for a while, the majority of the people that I would recommend people get to know, nobody's going to think twice if you screw up 10 times in a row, as long as you're like noticing it and recognizing it and trying to fix it.
Okay, awesome. So as a concluding thing here, I guess it would be great if you could describe where listeners can go to discover your content, and just general organizations you work with that you want people to kind of check out, anything at all like that.
Yeah. So if you're interested in sort of the rationalist thing in general, you should go to lesswrong.org. That's a web forum that has all of Eliezer's writings and new writings every day. If you're interested in the Center for Applied Rationality, you can check out rationality.org. If you're interested in the AI stuff, check out intelligence.org. That's my company's website, Miri's website. My own stuff is sort of scattered all over the place. A lot of it's on Facebook, but I do have a website. I'm currently trying to port it over to Sabien.net, but we're not at Sabien.net yet. So right now, all of my stuff is findable through thirdfoundation.github.io, and that'll take you to a Medium page as well, where I've got a bunch of my essays. But yeah, there's lots of good stuff out there. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality is out there. The sequences are out there. I just finished my own rationalist fan fiction, which is 650,000 words long, which is called Animorphs: The Reckoning, and people seem to like it okay.
There's some honest marketing for you.
But yeah, it's out there. I think Less Wrong, and my own stuff is a pretty good place to start.
Thank you for mentioning all of that. That's all great places. I'm going to link all of that in the description of this video. I really do recommend listeners check it out. Even if this is something you've never thought about before, it really could change your life. Like, I really do believe that, because it's so, like, if it's something you've never thought about before, then all of a sudden you're going to have like a new way of just thinking about things, which is always fascinating. And I really think it'll also make you happier and healthier and feel better about yourself. It does for me, certainly. And I'm just so happy I discovered this community. So I definitely recommend all those things. Thank you so much for joining me, Duncan. This was fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, awesome. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.